The wrong passenger. Mark's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his taxi, knuckles white against the worn leather. The clock on the dashboard blinked 12:37 a.m., its red digits a stark contrast to the darkness outside. He'd been driving for nearly 16 hours straight, the weight of fatigue pressing down on his eyelids. Just one more fare, he told himself. One more, and he could finally call it a night. The streets of the city were eerily quiet, devoid of the usual bustle that characterized even the latest hours. Streetlights cast long shadows across empty sidewalks, their amber glow creating islands of light in a sea of darkness. Mark's taxi crawled through this urban wasteland, the only sign of life in a world that seemed to have fallen asleep. As he turned onto Elm Street, a figure materialized at the corner. Mark's heart leaped. Finally, a passenger. He pulled up to the curb, the brakes squeaking softly in the silence. The back door opened, and a man slid into the seat. Mark waited for the customary greeting, the mention of a destination, but none came. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy. "Where to?" Mark asked, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet cab. There was a pause, then a low, gravelly voice responded, "Just drive." A chill ran down Mark's spine. Something about the voice seemed off. Familiar, yet distorted, like hearing his own voice played back on a warped tape. He adjusted the rear-view mirror, trying to get a better look at his passenger. The man sat perfectly still, his face obscured by shadows. But as they passed under a streetlight, Mark caught a glimpse of his features. His breath caught in his throat. It was like looking at a funhouse mirror version of himself. The same square jaw, the same nose that had been broken one too many times in his youth. But the eyes were all wrong. They were too dark, too deep, like wells of ink that threatened to pull him in. Mark's hands tightened on the wheel as he forced himself to look away. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself. Just his tired mind playing tricks on him. He cleared his throat. "I'm gonna need a destination, buddy. I can't just drive around all night." The passenger leaned forward, his face coming into view once more. This time, there was no mistaking it. It was Mark's face, but not quite. Older, harder, with a cruel twist to the mouth that Mark had never seen in his own reflection. "Oh, but you can," the passenger said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And you will." Mark's foot instinctively pressed down on the brake, but nothing happened. The cab continued to move forward, picking up speed. He tried to turn the wheel, but it was locked in place. Panic rising in his chest, Mark fumbled for the radio. "Dispatch, this is car 247. I've got a situation here." But instead of the familiar voice of the night dispatcher, all that came through was static. And beneath the white noise barely audible, he heard something that made his blood run cold. "Mark? Mark? Mark?" It was his name, whispered over and over, a sibilant hiss that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The passenger chuckled, a low, mirthless sound. "They can't help you now, Mark. It's just you and me." Mark's eyes darted to the GPS mounted on the dashboard. The familiar map of the city had vanished, replaced by a tangle of unfamiliar roads leading to a pulsing red dot. The estimated arrival time simply read, "Soon." As they drove, the city seemed to change around them. Buildings twisted and warped, their architecture becoming increasingly bizarre and impossible. Streetlights flickered and died as they passed, plunging the world into darkness only to flare back to life in their wake. Mark's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Or had he finally snapped, his sanity fraying after years of long nights and thankless fares? "Who are you?" he managed to croak out, his throat dry with fear. The passenger leaned back, his features once again swallowed by shadow. "I'm you, Mark. The you that could have been. The you that still might be." "That doesn't make any sense," Mark protested, but even as he said it, a part of him knew it was true. He recognized something in this twisted doppelganger, a darkness he had always tried to ignore, to push down deep inside himself. "Doesn't it?" the passenger asked. "Think back, Mark. Think about all the choices you've made, all the roads not taken." And suddenly, Mark was remembering. The scholarship he'd turned down because he was afraid of leaving his hometown. The woman he'd let go because he was too scared to commit. The dreams he'd abandoned because they seemed too risky, too difficult. With each memory, the city around them shifted and changed. Mark saw glimpses of other lives, other versions of himself flashing by outside the windows. In one, he was a successful businessman, striding purposefully down a busy street. In another, he was homeless, huddled in an alleyway with empty eyes. "Stop it," Mark whispered, squeezing his eyes shut. But the images continued to play behind his eyelids, a dizzying carousel of might-have-beens and never-weres. The passenger's voice cut through the chaos. "You can't hide from yourself, Mark. You can't run from the choices you've made." Mark's eyes snapped open. "Is that what this is about? Punishing me for my choices?" The doppelganger smiled, and this time the expression reached his eyes, filling them with a terrible light. "Punishment? No, Mark. This is about opportunity." The cab suddenly swerved, tires screeching as it left the road. Mark's hands flew off the wheel as they plunged down a steep embankment, the world outside becoming a blur of darkness and twisted shapes. When the motion finally stopped, Mark found himself staring at a familiar sight, his own apartment building. But like everything else in this nightmare world, it was wrong. The walls were crooked, the windows dark voids that seemed to swallow light. "Home sweet home," the passenger said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Mark's door swung open of its own accord. He tried to resist, to stay in the relative safety of the cab, but an unseen force pulled him out onto the sidewalk. The passenger followed, his movements fluid and predatory. "What do you want from me?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doppelganger spread his arms wide, encompassing the warped world around them. "I want you to see, Mark, to understand. Every choice you've made, every road you didn't take, they all led here. To me." As he spoke, the world seemed to ripple and shift. Mark saw flashes of his life playing out before him, but twisted and dark. He saw himself taking the scholarship, but using his education to embezzle millions. He saw himself marrying the woman he'd let go, only to become abusive and controlling. He saw himself pursuing his dreams, trampling over anyone who got in his way. "This isn't me," Mark protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Because deep down, he recognized the potential for these darker versions of himself, the capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for destruction that he'd always tried to ignore. The doppelganger stepped closer, his face now inches from Mark's own. But it could be. All it takes is one choice, one moment of weakness. Mark felt something press into his hand. He looked down to see that he was holding a gun, its weight unfamiliar and terrifying. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice shaking. The passenger, the other Mark, smiled. "Giving you a choice, the biggest one of all." He spread his arms wide, leaving himself exposed and vulnerable. "You can end this right now, Mark. One bullet and all these darker possibilities disappear. Or..." He let the word hang in the air, pregnant with possibility and threat. "Or," Mark prompted, hating himself for asking, for being curious. "Or you can embrace it. Embrace me. All the power, all the freedom you've denied yourself. No more late nights driving ungrateful passengers. No more scraping by, living a life of quiet desperation. You could have everything you've ever wanted." Mark's hand trembled, the gun feeling impossibly heavy. He looked at his doppelganger, this darker version of himself, and for a moment he was tempted to shed all his fears, his inhibitions, to take what he wanted without care for the consequences. But then he thought of his life, of the small kindnesses he'd shown and received, the quiet moments of connection with passengers who just needed someone to talk to, the sense of purpose he felt, even on the longest, most grueling nights. "No," he said, his voice growing stronger. "This isn't me, and it never will be." He turned the gun away from his doppelganger, pointing it at his own chest. The other Mark's eyes widened in surprise and... "Was that fear? What are you doing?" the doppelganger demanded, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time. Mark smiled, a sense of calm washing over him. Making a choice. He pulled the trigger. The world exploded into light and sound. Mark felt himself falling, tumbling through space and time. Images flashed before his eyes, all the moments of his life, big and small, that had shaped him into who he was. Not perfect, not without regrets, but fundamentally good. And then, suddenly, it was over. Mark's eyes snapped open. He was in his cab, parked by the curb where he'd picked up the passenger. The clock on the dashboard read 12:38 a.m. Only a minute had passed. His heart racing, Mark twisted in his seat, looking into the back. It was empty. No sign of the strange passenger, no evidence of the nightmarish journey he'd just experienced. Had it all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? As Mark sat there trying to calm his breathing, trying to make sense of what had happened, his radio crackled to life. "Car 247, you still on the clock?" It was the night dispatcher, her voice reassuringly normal. Mark hesitated for a moment, then reached for the radio. "Yeah, I'm here. Just took a little break." "Well, break's over. Got a pickup for you on 5th and Main. You good to take it?" Mark looked at himself in the rearview mirror. He saw the lines of fatigue, the weight of years of long nights and hard work, but he also saw strength there and kindness. He saw a man who had made his choices and lived with them, for better or worse. "Yeah," he said, starting the engine. "Yeah, I'm good." As he pulled away from the curb, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just passed some kind of test. That somewhere, in some other reality, another version of himself had made a different choice. But here, in this reality, Mark was exactly who he was meant to be. And as he drove through the quiet streets, heading towards his next fare, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He'd faced the darkness within himself, and he'd chosen the light. And that, he realized, was the most important choice of all. The end of his shift could wait. Right now, there were people who needed a ride, and Mark was exactly where he needed to be.